I'm Jeremy Brecher, and I was here in Washington from 1965 to 1970. I was primarily based at the Institute for Policy Studies. I was a student and then promoted to being an associate fellow. And I also worked for Congressman Robert Kastenmeier, and I worked for the Friends Committee on National Legislation for quite a while. And used to bill myself a Quaker military expert.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is Lessons of the 60s on October 13th, 2013, interviewing Jeremy Brecher, a Washington activist.
So I was in Washington most of the time from 1965 to 1970. I had been a student at Reed College and a student activist, and had read about the Institute for Policy Studies, and before that about the Liberal Caucus, which was founded by Arthur Wasco and Marcus Raskin, who thereupon founded the Institute for Policy Studies. And when Arthur Wasco came to my college and spoke, I said, "How do I go to the Institute?" And he said, "Well, write us a letter." And boom, the next year I was a student at the Institute for Policy Studies. It was an extremely interesting and educational place to be during the 1960s because it was the interface between the social movements that were developing around the country and the world of power that Washington, D.C. represents. When I first got here, one of the first experiences I had was they said, "Oh, there's a demonstration for erased chalk." I said, "What's erased chalk?" They said, "The guy who owns the public transportation system, the bus system, is the ultimate villain for Washington, D.C., the greatest oppressor of poor people. His name's Roy Chalk, and we're having a demonstration to prevent the building of highways through neighborhoods and to campaign for public transportation instead." Nowadays, when I talk to younger people in Washington and say, "Do you know why there is a metro in Washington? Did you know that once there was no public transportation except the bus system?" And I find very often they know absolutely nothing about this story, but it's because of the emergency Committee on the Transportation Crisis, ECTC, that Washington has its amazingly nice and useful public transportation system. That was created because the city made the mistake of trying to put, or whoever was pushing for the highway made the mistake of trying to put it through the house of an old organizer who not only organized his neighbors to oppose it, but then went and made a coalition with inner city blacks to fight for public transportation rather than just to stop the highway. And as they say, the rest is history.
That would have been Sammy Abbott.
Sammy Abbott,
right.
Who eventually became the mayor of Tacoma Park, but before that was just a freelance artist, designer who led this struggle.
When did you get to Washington again?
65. It would have been fall of 65. So that was one of the first experiences I had. And the people that I knew just grabbed me up and took me to it. And the other thing that I remember from the earliest days was the presence of Women's Strike for Peace. They had an extremely active chapter in Washington. It may have been the first, certainly an early one. And they were pioneering a style of activism that I think we all have come to know since then. Much more militant. I mean, it really was the grandmother of Code Pink, with much direct action, much more in your face, and much more kind of freewheeling stylistically than any of the movements, either peace movements or women's movements that had preceded it. So that was created a lot of the buzz in the atmosphere. Also, IPS was a Washington base for SNCC and was involved in a lot of activities. Of course, I got here a couple of years after the March on Washington and after many of the big civil rights demonstrations in Washington. But there were people from SNCC who were using this as a base for example, organizing co-ops and economic activities for black workers in the South. So that was a significant part of it. And also they were making a push into the DC City Council and into DC politics. People out of the chapter at some of the major colleges in the district had SNCC chapters and were running candidates and pushing into the political system. Then the probably most dramatic activities were around the Vietnam War and the resistance to the Vietnam War. Of course, Washington was a focus for the big national demonstrations, and I could talk about that, but you probably have lots of people who can talk about that.
Well, I'd like to talk about that, but I'd like to say one other thing relating to when you got to Washington in 1965. That was also the same time that Marion Barry,
yes,
when SNCC came to Washington and became a local leader, indeed, in the transportation fight.
Right.
He was the one that got people to pay their bus tolls in pennies to slow down the bus system. So you must have come right at the same time he didn't know that started.
And that was the political things I was talking about, and the Howard SNCC chapter was really a crucial, both his base of operations and very important in developing a more militant civil rights movement here, with also the DC statehood campaign as a central piece of that. Reverend Fauntleroy and a gentleman whose name I'm forgetting, who was worked for the city library, who was a very important leader in that effort, and there's very, very strong sort of indigenous community leader for DC, and specifically on the statehood campaign. So that was all. This stuff was all in the air very much. Well, one of the things that was interesting was, since there hadn't been any of these kinds of movements on this scale for a very, very long time, we didn't really know what was happening. We didn't. Now you can look back with historical perspective and say, oh, that was the 60s, and this is what happened, and it had a generational component and a racial component and a sort of crisis in the ruling class components, and analyze it in those ways. We were just making up the playbook as we went, and that was part of the excitement of it, but also part of the reasons we had great difficulty and made some significant errors of judgment and mistakes along the way.
Tell me about the big peace demonstrations that you went to as soon as you got here.
Well, even before I got here, I came down for the first one was right after Kennedy was elected in, I'm going to say 61. I have to check the dates, but it was organized by a group at Harvard called Toxin, in alliance with the Student Peace Union, which was the first beginning of a student peace movement at that time. And then, and I believe that Mark Raskin was involved in the reception. He was in the Kennedy administration at that point and was involved in seeing that the students who came had some opportunity to talk with government officials and so on. Then relatively soon after that, there was another demonstration against what was then appeared to be an impending attack on Cuba. Well, it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, there was one also about Bay of Pigs. And I can't remember whether I actually got down here for that, but then in my student networks in Connecticut, we would come down whenever there was a Washington demonstration. We were part of the hinterland that floated down. I missed the March on Washington, but my mother attended it in '63.
The '63 March.
Yeah. And then I can't give you the date, but as was mentioned, you mentioned before, the first major demonstration, national demonstration against the Vietnam War was organized by SDS.
SDS in April '65.
April 60, I thought it was 65. That we thought when there were maybe 20,000 people at it, we thought the revolution had broken out. I had studied the history of student movements and radical movements, and I never expected in my lifetime to see anything like that. I didn't know we were going to be putting 1 million people on the green against the war within 3 or 4 years. And that's part of why I say we didn't know we had no historical handle on what it was that was happening and what we were doing. We just knew we had to do it. So Washington, of course, played an important role, and Washington activists played an important role as part of the organizing base that made some of those marches possible. There were a series. I had come out of SDS and been very active in SDS. But by the time I was in Washington, SDS was already in its kind of both extremely rapid growth and proliferation, but also internal disintegration. So we had an SDS chapter. It was more or less based at Institute for Policy Studies, but it involved a lot of people who weren't there. It was an at-large chapter. It didn't have a particular university base. And people in it played a role in a number of efforts. In fact, there was a kind of floating coordinating committee. It went under various names over the course of the decade. But the National Committee to End the War in Vietnam, and the MOB, the mobilization, and the new MOB, and so on, they were all essentially just a continuing ad hoc leadership for the anti-war movement. And a lot of the Washington activists were involved with that. James Bevel, who was one of the leaders in SCLC, moved to Washington and set up his operation to be the leadership for that at one point, but it had before and after also. Dave Dellinger played a significant role on it and was based down here a lot in that period. And a lot of the Washington folks, one way or another, because it was so open and ad hoc, played a disproportionate role in kind of staffing and helping lead those efforts. And then, of course, by the time you get to the later 1960s, you're getting to the huge moratorium demonstrations, which were, and maybe you're talking 70, 71, that really represented just a extraordinary mass outpouring of opposition to the war across the country that focused for a while in those actions. And in Washington, I should say that the anti-war sentiment and to some extent organization spread and spread and spread. So, for example, there were groups in various government agencies. There were anti-war groups that formed. The NIH had one of the main ones, but there were others also. Where it was spreading into workplaces and that kind of sectoral spread. And that's something that certainly should be talked with. I know Irene Wasco-Elkin was a leader in that. If you ever want to, she's one person that you could talk to about that, who I think would be well worth talking to. She's now out in the Midwest, but she has strong memories and so on about it. Another thing that should also definitely be kept in mind is that some of the early development of the women's liberation movement took place in Washington. In the environment of the New Left and SDS, there were early efforts to articulate what were initially seen as just another logical part of what SDS and the New Left were about. That, of course, equal treatment for women and women's self-organization would be natural, just like for any other constituency. Met a surprising amount of opposition. Women were harassed and jeered at meetings and things like that. And part of the development of the independent women's movement actually emerged from that in the late 60s, 69, 70. Very first in SNCC, but very rapidly within SDS and with the emergence of women's caucuses in SDS. And there were a number of people in DC. Unfortunately, I can't give you names right off, although Marilyn Saltzman Webb and Heather Booth, actually I can give you those two names. And I worked with them a little bit because they wanted to do outreach to labor, and we went to some meetings, and they wanted some men to go along to show that it wasn't an anti-male development. And so I went to some meetings with them. One was to the Labor Education Local 189, I remember, and some others to try to support what we rapidly found was an emerging women's movement. And I think one other thing I should mention is this was also the era of the black uprisings or riots or whatever you want to call them. As far as Washington was concerned, there was, during the summers of 65 and through 67 or 68, every weekend there would be tear. If you went someplace like Columbia Road, you could smell the tear gas. There was attempting to control movements, unorganized, but protest activity, riots in black communities in DC, and then after the assassination of Martin Luther King, the military occupation of the city in response to the riots. I remember waking up and seeing military vehicles coming down my little one-lane, one-way street, Corcoran Street, which became very fashionable, but at that time was a very poor ghetto street. And basically the military occupation of the city. There were some rather, let's say, quixotic efforts by some of the, there were what became weatherman folks in Washington at that time. Some of them were actually around the Institute for Policy Studies to some extent. Kathy Wilkerson would be one name, and there were some others. And they actually decided that they would go out and try to start a white riot in another part of Washington in order to try to divert the police from suppressing the black riots. That gives you some sense of the milieu and the atmosphere that weatherman and some of those types of activities and way of thinking came out of.
Did they do it?
Well, my impression is they went out there and they didn't find that the masses were prepared to give them a lot of support. But you need to talk to them because I was at there was a forum that was called at IPS concerning how to respond to the riots. and that was one of the positions that was taken, let's put it that way. I think that this is just one other thing I should say is that there was a lot of effort to do interracial activities in Washington communities. I lived part of the time in Adams Morgan, and Mark Raskin and Arthur Wasco lived on Wyoming Avenue, and were very involved with a cultural center that was called The New Thing, and running Topper Carew. Yes, Topper Carew and Wasco 2 was our parody of, there was a famous political slogan, Tippy Canoe, and so Topper Carew and Wasco 2 was, of course, Arthur as a historian came up with that one. So there was a lot of effort, and I think some of the what Adams Morgan became as a cultural multicultural center, I'm not going to say it was caused by that, but let's say the door was kept open. When they first came to Washington, Adams Morgan was one of the few integrated communities anywhere in the city, and so a lot of progressive people gravitated to there, and so it continued. So the activities that they participated in, let's say, it helped keep the door open to it being a culturally mixed, relatively unsegregated community.
To wrap this up,
Yep.
can you quickly tell me what you think your 5 very active years in Washington did for the rest of your life? How did it affect or direct the rest of your life?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure that maybe if I have a few more decades to reflect on it, I could answer it better. It was a tremendous educational experience. It was a tremendous interface between different things that were going in different aspects of the society. I personally decided that I wanted to go out to America. And I wanted to go back to the town that I had come from and connect with people who were outside of Washington, who were not part of what was inevitably a very hothouse atmosphere. And so for the subsequent many decades, while I've come to Washington for demonstrations and brought my family to Washington for demonstrations, I've come here for conferences, I've come here to do things with the Institute for Policy Studies and with other activist groups, but I made the decision that my base was going to be not here, but out in the hinterland, and I've lived in the same community, well, except for a couple of years, ever since I left Washington, and sunk in my roots there. That's one piece of it. I'm not saying that I was right or that anyone else should have that attitude about it, but that was part of what I learned, was that I didn't want to spend my entire life in that hothouse political atmosphere. Instead, I've been just as much of an activist since as I was then. But I think I left with a sense of the value of there being that kind of interface. It's just I wanted to be more on one side of that than the other. I think that the unpredictability of mass movements, of their rising and their decline, was something that I had the opportunity to observe up close, and it's helped me understand and be able to participate more creatively in something like Occupy Wall Street, recognizing that it probably was going to be an upsurge and then probably not going to become the new AFL-CIO or something like that, and probably better that it not. But I got to get a sense of how social movements interface with other aspects of life in complex kinds of time frames. I learned that attitudes and positions that are taken with extreme passion and certainty at one time, a year or two later, the people who held them may be in a very different place. And this is really useful in terms of working in the long run. You may disagree now, or you may say, well, they're really off the beam. But you may turn out that something very different is the people who were your opponents 2 years ago are your allies today, and vice versa. And I learned that a free-flowing environment of ideas and experimental action where people are able to put strategies and hypotheses out and have them be taken up for a while and played with and tried out and tested is both an extremely exciting way to live and also a very creative way to address the problems of making social change.
Thank you. You're a historian by choice, or?
I'm basically a freelance writer.
Okay. So.
But I've written a lot of history books, and I did a long series of Connecticut Public Television shows on Connecticut history topics that some of them I was the producer, but most of them I was the sort of the content person for. And then I did a long running series of oral history-based radio programs for Connecticut Public Radio. They didn't go national, but they were very Connecticut. Well, I'll tell one that I thought was and it will be interesting to see. It interfaces with other things, I'm sure, an event that I'm sure other people will tell you about also from different perspectives. And it has to do with one of the big Pentagon demonstrations, like 67 or 68.
67 was the big one.
I wish I could tell you. The marker was actually, maybe it was later, because it was after. I could talk about 67, but lots of people can tell you about that. This was right after the invasion of Cambodia, so it's 70.
May 70.
And I was actually just getting ready to leave. That's when I left, but and it was after the Panther, right? But it was all in the context of the Panther trial in New Haven, and it was huge, and it was also at a point of where the anti-war movement and also the Panthers and various emerging Black Power sectors were really an explosive situation, both explosive in numbers and outreach and explosive in terms of moving toward more violent forms of confrontation. And so what I was doing was attempting to foment a general strike. And we were reaching out to the groups that were organizing in government and other occupations. And we were also, it was the time, it's now often not known, but this was a big period of labor confrontation in the United States, especially 70 to 72. And there was, in fact, a huge wildcat strike of postal workers. And so we were also trying to push for other strikes by other government workers as part of the same thing. I would now regard this as a very quixotic effort and pretty abstract effort without actually understanding the politics of how these things actually happen and emerge. So from my, in terms of self-criticism, I would say it was rooted in I would say this would be an illustration of abstract lefty politics, pretty much. If you want to know something about the postal workers' strike and some of these efforts, there's a section about it in my labor history book, Strike, and also the story that I'm telling now. I wrote up in a book called Save the Humans, Common Preservation in Action, which is quasi-autobiographical, and it has quite a bit about some of these things during the period I was in Washington. So that's just a reference that may be something to have in your collection or take a look at. Some of the early women's liberation things in Washington are in there. Some of the peace movement things are in there. Some of the things I've been talking about, in other words, are in Save the Humans. So what actually happened was not a general strike, but as people poured into Washington, basically the Nixon administration played a trick. They refused to give any permits. They made the whole thing seem like it was going to be a huge confrontation, and then at the last minute, and all the people who were coming in were girded up for extremely militant responses and occupations and stuff like that. And then at the last, and they were negotiating with the peace movement leadership right up to the last minute. And then all of a sudden, at the last minute, they gave all the permits, and all the steam went out of the demonstration, and it became just another big demonstration with a lot of people, but not the kind of confrontation that was being looked for either by the people who wanted a violent confrontation or by the ones who wanted mass nonviolent type confrontation. The one group that was truly successful in that setting, from what I could see,
In 1970.
This is 1970. I'm passing out flyers with backing from Dave Dellinger, who was head of at that point was the chair of the new MOB or whichever one it was. Darn good pamphlet, but pretty abstract relative to what was actually going on. The Peace Corps volunteers had their own anti-war network, and they came into Washington, and they went out and occupied the Peace Corps headquarters and shut up everything and barricaded themselves in there. You'd have to go back and check, but my impression is that then led other people to go and just find buildings, government buildings that were open, that they could get into, and go in and occupy them. And the Peace Corps volunteers stayed in for quite a long time until they were threatened with really serious repercussions, and the others lasted from a few hours to a day or two. But that was the one case where people actually were able to make it be something more than just a big demonstration, which under normal circumstances would be fine, but in this incredibly conflicted and heated atmosphere where the population was swinging radically against the war, but people didn't know what was the next step, and how do you push it on to the next step. Those people who had concrete drive and motivation to do that were the ones who actually were able to do something that pushed it to a next step. Neither me with my calls for a general strike, nor the people who were trying to push violent confrontations and stuff like that. We were basically not, were neither wise nor effective in what we were trying to do. So I would just give that as one example. It's not and I give it partially because it's a self-critique as much as a critique of others. And I think that's one of the things I've learned is movements strengthen themselves by thinking about what they've done wrong, and so do individuals. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's delighted to be able to do that.